All right, welcome back, everyone. So in this part, this is part four, what we're going to begin looking at and taking a look at are different types of muscle fibers. So if you recall from chapter 9, so from the previous set of lectures, we looked at muscle fibers in general, and we looked at how the action potential or how the nerve impulse flows down a neuron or a nerve cell, and then it's conveyed to a muscle fiber or a muscle cell. And then we looked at how that muscle cell itself contracts. So how does that muscle shorten? How does it lengthen? What are the different molecules that are involved? So we talked about acetylcholine and ATP and calcium. We talked about the sarcomere. And so we talked about how the muscle contracts. What we didn't talk about, and what we'll look at here, are different types of muscle fibers. And the different muscle fibers, as we'll see, they'll differ in terms of the contraction that they generate. So how much force they're able to generate. They'll differ in terms of their ability to resist fatigue. So how, in other words, what is their endurance like? They also differ in terms of their color. They differ in terms of how they make or how they produce their energy, so how they produce their ATP, right? So we can look here and we can see that they're going to differ in a couple ways. And in general, we'll call these fibers fast twitch fibers or fast twitch muscle fibers or slow twitch muscle fibers, right? You call them fast twitch, you call them slow twitch, depending on various characteristics of the muscle fiber itself. Some of them have more blood supply, they have more of a particular type of protein that we'll talk about in the next slide. They make more ATP, they have more mitochondria. And so you call them one thing, fast twitch or slow twitch, and then you call the other ones the opposite, right? And so we'll look here. So before we actually talk about some of the characteristics of the fibers themselves, we have to look inside the fiber at a particular protein that is called myoglobin, right? So myoglobin sounds an awful lot like hemoglobin. And so if you're familiar with hemoglobin or you've heard it, you may know that hemoglobin is the globular protein that circulates in the blood. So it's part of the red blood cells that circulate in our blood. And it is what actually binds the oxygen molecules and transports the oxygen molecules from the lung, so from the alveoli, to the level of the cells and the level of the tissue, right? So once you take oxygen from the lung, you bind it to hemoglobin, you transport it to the tissue, and you unload it. There's a separate but similar molecule in our skeletal muscles that actually binds the oxygen in the muscle, and this is called myoglobin. All right. So if you think of these two terms, hemoglobin and myoglobin, heme and hemoglobin, heme or hemo refers to blood. Right. So hemoglobin is a globular protein in the blood. Myoglobin, the term myo refers to muscle. So this is a globular protein that we find in our muscle, particularly in our in the actual muscle cells, right? So the myoglobin itself contributes to the color of the actual cell, all right? So if you have more myoglobin, the red tends to be much darker. So we've heard of dark meat or light meat or white meat, and we'll look at that as an example here in just a little bit. But the myoglobin here in the muscle is actually binding the oxygen, right? Now, there are some differences between hemoglobin and myoglobin. Hemoglobin is able to bind 4 oxygen molecules, whereas whereas myoglobin is able to bind only 1. Myoglobin also has a higher affinity or a greater attraction to oxygen, right? In AMP2 course, you'll look at something called the oxyhemoglobin dissociation curve, and this curve looks different than the curve for myoglobin because it's made of different kind of protein subunits, and it binds oxygen a little bit differently. Okay, so what we can have is we can also have a clinical kind of correlate here in which you have a breakdown of muscle tissue as a result of some extreme forceful, very high exertion activity, all right? And this is called rhabdomyolysis or rhabdomyolysis, all right? So this is sometimes just abbreviated rhabdo. This can occur due to some type of extreme exertion. So you're working out to a very extensive degree. You're having a decreasing the amount of oxygen that's sent to your muscles. Other types of drugs and toxins may cause this as well. And so what this is this is a condition in which the muscles themselves, the muscles and the muscle fibers, begin to break down, they begin to be destroyed, and they leak out different things that are on the inside, right? One of these is a molecule called creatine, right? And so we talked about creatine a little bit in chapter 9, a little bit whenever we talked about how we're able to make ATP via different sources. And so this creatine and this enzyme can be detected, this enzyme called creatine kinase can be detected in the blood, and there's a normal level of it that's circulating in the blood, relatively small, and so you can test the blood and see if you have increased amounts of this protein, and this could indicate that some type of muscle injury has occurred and maybe the cause of the rhabdomyolysis. Right now, the big issue with this is as you leak this creatine into the blood, that blood is circulating throughout the body and it goes to the kidneys, and it can cause damage to the kidneys, and it can cause something called acute kidney injury, or AKI, right? And so this image to the right of the screen, this is a picture and a sample of urine from an individual who has rhabdomyolysis. It's sometimes referred to as tea-colored urine or cola-colored urine because of this dark, very dark nature due to the creatine in the urine, as well as the myoglobin as well, right? So the big thing with this condition with rhabdomyolysis is preventing additional injury to the kidney, right? So administering lots of fluids and increasing fluid intake is one of the kind of main priorities, main goals in instances of rhabdomyolysis, all right? So if we now get into actually looking at our actual muscle fibers, we'll see that we have two general types, all right? And with these two general types, we'll have subtypes. So these are called oxidative and glycolytic fibers, all right? Now, the reason they're called oxidative and glycolytic, they're named according to how they get their energy, all right? How do these muscle types produce their ATP, right? If they are oxidative fibers, they do it via aerobic respiration. Oxidative in this case is referring to the presence of oxygen, right? So we require oxygen and we're doing it via aerobic respiration. Aerobic meaning in the presence of oxygen, all right? Because you have oxygen present, you're able to produce large quantities of ATP. You have lots of ATP, as we said in the previous lecture, chapter 9. You need ATP for contraction, for relaxation of muscles. You need it to pump the calcium back into the sarcoplasmic reticulum. So if you have lots of ATP, you're able to contract your muscles for a longer period of time. So these fibers are also called fatigue-resistant fibers, right? They can contract for long periods of time without needing to rest, right? Now, because they have lots of oxygen, they need to have a way to get the oxygen into the muscle, or to the muscle at least, and so they have a very large blood supply. So they have extensive capillaries, they have lots of mitochondria because that's used to produce the ATP, and then they have lots of myoglobin that again contributes to this red color, and the myoglobin is what binds the oxygen while in the tissue, right? So if you know what oxidative fibers are, you essentially know what the other ones are because they're exactly the same except they're different in every way, right? So these are called glycolytic fibers. Glycolytic is referring to no oxygen. So we've alluded to a process called glycolysis by which you break down a glucose molecule, and you do not have to have oxygen to do this, all right? Now, it can occur in the presence of oxygen, but you don't have to have oxygen in order to do this, all right? So this is termed anaerobic respiration, right? As we alluded to in the chapter 9 lecture, glycolysis or anaerobic respiration makes some ATP, but it makes relatively little ATP compared to aerobic respiration, right? So we have very little ATP available. These fibers also have very few mitochondria, again, contributing to the overall lack of ATP in the muscle. They typically are a different color. They're a little bit lighter in color, so more kind of maybe light pink or white color. And this is because there's less blood flow to the muscle, and there's also less myoglobin because we're not binding as much oxygen because we're doing things via anaerobic respiration. All right. They may have large glycogen reserves. So glycogen is a type of starch, animal starch, which is just made up of lots and lots of individual glucose monomers. And so you can break down that glycogen in order to then break down the glucose, and that's the whole point of these glycolytic fibers, is they're breaking down excuse me, they're breaking down glucose molecules, right? So these are also called white fibers. These are very fatigable, right? They're fatigable because they have relatively little ATP available. Excuse me, I have something in my throat. So they have relatively little ATP available, and so they're able to contract and relax and contract and relax, but they can't do it for a very extensive amount of time, right? So we'll see in a little bit this has different implications, right? So if you look at this image, you can see some of the differences between our oxidative and our glycolytic fibers. Now these are also called slow twitch and fast twitch, and this is what we alluded to previously. So the oxidative fibers, because they have lots of ATP, they can contract for long periods of time. These are called slow twitch fibers, right? They are slow twitch, they contract with less force, generating less tension, but they can do so over a longer period of time, so they're very fatigue resistant compared to our fast twitch fibers. Break down glucose, produce a little bit of ATP, they produce greater amounts of tension, they contract much more quickly than the slow twitch fibers, but they fatigue relatively easily, right? So these are the fast twitch fibers. These are used for very short bursts of energy like sprinting or weightlifting, something like that, right? Now, so for both of these, slow twitch or oxidative and fast twitch glycolytic, there are different types, all right? So we'll look at these. So for our oxidative, we have two different types here, right? There's one called slow oxidative and one called fast oxidative, right? They're also called type 1 and type 2B. I'm sorry, type 2A. So for type 1, these are the kind of typical slow twitch fibers that we've been thinking of, right? They contract relatively slowly, generate little power and little tension, but they have a very large blood supply, lots of myoglobin to bind lots of oxygen, so they can make lots of ATP, so they can contract for longer periods of time, right? So very high endurance, think like long distance running, or think of muscles like of the neck or muscles of the back that are always contracting to some degree or another, maintaining posture, maintaining the position of the head, maintaining the position of the vertebral column. So right now, as you're sitting or standing or whatnot, you have muscles of your neck and back that are contracted to maintain your posture, maintain the position of those bones and of those regions, right? So you don't think about them contracting, but they do so for very long periods of time, right? They are relatively thin, but they are very dark, again, because of the presence of lots of myoglobin, right? So over to the right, you can see those different types here. So these are the slow oxidative fibers that we see here, these kind of dark brown ones here, very dark red, right? So you also have fast oxidative. Fast oxidative are still oxidative fibers, right? So they're still utilizing aerobic respiration. They may have a little bit less blood supply, so there's a little bit less oxygen, there's a little bit less myoglobin, so these tend to be slightly less red or slightly lighter in color compared to the slow oxidative or the type 1, right? These are sometimes called intermediate fibers because they're an intermediate type of fiber between the slow oxidative that we just mentioned, and then the next one we'll talk about that's called fast glycolytic. They're kind of an intermediary type. They're somewhere in between. So they have features in terms of their blood supply and number of mitochondria and amount of ATP produced and myoglobin and whatnot, color. They're kind of an intermediary between the two, right? And then the last type is the fast glycolytic, right? So the fast glycolytic fiber, these are the kind of quote unquote fast twitch fibers, generate lots of force, lots of tension. They contract very quickly, but they contract very briefly, right? So very fast contraction, lots of force, lots of tension, but not for long periods of time, right? The reason they don't contract for long periods of time is because one, they have less blood supply, so they have less oxygen, so they're able to produce less ATP, right? Now, because they have less blood supply and less oxygen, they have less myoglobin, so these appear the lightest in color. These appear very white, right? So fast glycolytic, you can look down here at these FG, fast glycolytic. These are the very light colored ones here, all right? So these muscle fiber types you would find in an individual who participates in some type of activity that requires very short bursts of energy, but these aren't lasting very long, but the amount of tension and force that's required is very great, right? So think a 100-meter sprinter or something like that. They contract their muscles for a very short period of time, maybe 9, 10, 11 seconds. And then they use up their ATP that's supplied to them via anaerobic respiration or maybe the phosphate transfer system. They utilize that very quickly, so they're not able to continue contracting for long periods of time, right? You could also think of like a weightlifter who's doing very powerful, tense contractions, but for very short amounts of time, right? So you can think of these in a different context, and it may make a little bit more sense. So we're going to look at it in the context of a chicken, all right? So we all, well, I guess we don't all. Some of us maybe eat chicken, maybe you don't, but if you don't, maybe you have at least seen chicken before, right? And you may even have chickens. So we have two general parts of the chicken that we'll look at. We'll look at the chicken wings, right? And we'll look at the chicken thighs and the chicken legs, right? So if you look on the left, those are the chicken wings. Ones on the right, those are the chicken thighs or the chicken legs, right? I'm not sure what these little black things are. Maybe these are pieces of pepper, like peppercorns or something. I don't know. So on the left, you have the chicken wings. You notice that they're light in color. They're relatively white. On the right, the chicken thighs and the chicken legs are relatively dark, kind of a pinkish red, purple color, right? They're obviously darker than the wings on the left. So these color differences reflect the different types of muscle fibers that you find in chicken wings versus chicken thighs and chicken legs, right? So if you have chickens, think about the type of activity that you see your chickens do. Or if you don't have chickens, just think in general what a chicken would do, right? It walks around a lot, right? You typically don't see chickens flying, right? You don't look out your dorm right now or out of your house or out your window and see chickens flying around, right? You see other types of birds, but you're not seeing chickens, right? So chickens walk around a lot. So because they don't fly very often, their muscle fibers that make up their wings don't need to have a very great endurance because they're not really flying that often, right? They may fly from one side of a chicken coop to another area or to get away from a dog or a predator or something, but not very extensive flying, right? So the fiber types are going to be those that contract very rapidly, very quickly, but for very short periods of time, right? And so if you think about what that is, that's our fast twitch fiber, right? That's maybe the fast glycolytic fiber, the type 2B. They contract very quickly, but not for very long. They have less blood supply, they have less oxygen, less myoglobin, so they appear a much lighter color, right? They contract rapidly, very quickly, but they are very fatigable, right? They are not fatigue resistant, right? So if you then go over to the chicken thigh and the chicken leg, it's exactly the opposite, right? You look out your window and you see lots of chickens walking around and they're pecking at the ground and the food, and they contract their muscles of their legs and thighs all day, every day as they walk around, right? However, that contraction is not extremely powerful, right? They're just walking around. Whenever you just walk around your house or campus or wherever, you're not exerting maximal force with the muscles of your legs, right? You're just kind of leisurely walking, right? That's what the chickens are doing. So they need to be able to contract their muscles for longer periods of time, right? Have a greater endurance, but they don't necessarily need to have a great amount of tension and force be produced by them, right? So because they need to contract for long periods of time, they need lots of oxygen, so they need a greater blood supply, and they need myoglobin to be able to bind that oxygen, so they appear a very dark red color, right? So these fibers would be those slow twitch fibers, the slow oxidative type 1 fibers, right? So you can think of this, and it may help you kind of understand these things a little bit better. Okay? So this is a summary of the different fiber types that you can look at here, right? Okay, so we can also have different changes that occur to our muscle in response to training. So these type 1 and type 2 fibers can change. So by aerobic training, so doing things that are, where we are utilizing oxygen, we can increase the capacity and the power of our muscles to contract in aerobic conditions. You can increase the size of our type 1 muscle fibers, so those kind of slow twitch fibers. You can also lead to overall muscle hypertrophy, right? So muscle hypertrophy is referring to the fact that muscles and the cells are getting larger, right? So there's little, if any, increase in the number of cells. So that would be hyperplasia. This is instead hypertrophy, which is taking the individual muscles, muscle fibers, the muscle cells, and making those bigger, all right? So how do we make the individual muscle cells bigger, right? We're not increasing the number per se, but we're increasing the size. So what you have is, if you think about this cell, the muscle cell, inside of it you have those myofibrils, and inside the myofibrils you have myofilaments, right? The myofilaments are the actin and the myosin and all of those, right? So if we begin synthesizing and producing more of these proteins, these contractile proteins, actin, myosin. You add more on the inside of the myofibril, so the myofibril gets bigger, or you add more myofibrils, and then you add more myofibrils so the muscle fiber stretches and it gets larger, so the entire muscle gets larger, right? The exact opposite thing happens whenever we get smaller, and that's what we'll talk about here in just a little bit, okay? So in general, we have kind of two types of muscle hypertrophy, right? You have what you can think of as physiological normal muscle hypertrophy, right? You're doing some type of resistance training, weight training, the muscles grow in size. You also have what you can think of as non-physiological or artificial muscle hypertrophy, right? So look at these two images here and you tell me which one is normal muscle hypertrophy, right? Normal physiological. Is it this one or is it this one, right? So hopefully you can look at this and you can tell immediately which one is normal and physiological and which one is not normal, not physiological. So the one on the top, I don't really know what the hell this is. He did something to his biceps. You can obviously see the biceps are not at all proportional with the forearms and not at all proportional with really the rest of the body. So I think he injected some type of oil or something that caused those muscles to increase in size, but just those muscles. Okay, so it looks completely stupid and completely unnatural, right? On the bottom, on the other hand, you have more normal physiological muscle hypertrophy, right? So you're working out, you're doing some type of resistance training, right? And you increase the size of the muscle, you're increasing the tone, and so the muscle is more defined, right? So you can see biceps, you can see trapezius, you can see pectoralis major and abdominal muscles. You see those become much more defined. You see deltoids are more defined as well. All of those as a result of normal physiological hypertrophy, weight training, strength training, something like that. Okay. Now, on the opposite side of the spectrum, you have muscle atrophy, right? And so muscle atrophy is the shrinking of a muscle, right? The decrease in the size of a muscle, and one type of muscle hypertrophy, muscle atrophy, is called disuse atrophy, right? Disuse atrophy is atrophy due to the lack of use, right? So from disuse, right? So you have something called sarcopenia. Sarcopenia is largely what you see in the middle image. This is essentially normal loss of muscle tissue, normal loss of muscle mass as a result of the aging process, right? It's just normal, age-related. As you increase in age, your diet probably changes, your physical activity, schedule changes, you're perhaps not as active. And so the muscles themselves are not going to be quite as large, quite as defined, right? Now you can see on the right and the left, you have what you can think of as disuse atrophy, right? So the one on the right, the left leg here, so this is the left leg, this is normal, right? You can see definition of the calf and soleus. On the right, so our left, but the patient's right, very thin, right? So this is post-op, about a month post-op of after Achilles tendon repair, right? So if you've ever torn your Achilles, you know that's extremely painful, and you are non-weight bearing for a large or for a very long time. And so if you are non-weight bearing, you're not putting weight on that limb, you're not using that limb, and so the muscles of that limb are also largely not being used, and so they begin to shrink in size, right? They begin to atrophy, right? You can see, you know this too if you've ever broken your arm or something and you had a cast that maybe went up your forearm. After you had the cast taken off, you can notice usually a pretty distinct difference between the arm that had the cast and the arm that didn't have the cast. In the context of how skinny the arm is that had the cast on it, right? You didn't use those muscles quite as often, so they begin to atrophy. Now, the last one on the left, this is an example of thenar atrophy. Thenar, this kind of fatty, it's not really fatty, but it's this meaty pad of muscle at the base of our thumb. This is called the thenar eminence. There's 3 little muscles here that help move the thumb. And there is a nerve that supplies this group of muscles called the median nerve, right? And we talked about the median nerve when we discussed carpal tunnel in previous lectures. There's a branch off the median nerve that innervates this thenar eminence. So in carpal tunnel, you have compression of the median nerve that leads to denervation of the thenar eminence. So there's a lack of innervation to the thenar eminence. If there's a lack of innervation, there's a lack of use. And so if there's a lack of use, the muscles begin to shrink, right? So you can see on this hand, the skin is relatively smooth. It looks nice and kind of round and kind of plump and full. If you look on this one, you can see more wrinkles over the thenar eminence. The muscles themselves are much smaller. So you can feel this pad of muscle at the base of your thumb in this region. You also have one kind of at the base of your fifth finger called the hypothenar eminence. But for the thenar eminence, again, as you move your thumb across your palm, like you're bringing your thumb and your pinky together, you can then feel that thenar eminence, and it is contracted, right? And so if you have carpal tunnel syndrome and you have this denervation of the thenar eminence, you can have this shrinking or this atrophy of this group of muscle, right? This group of muscles. So this kind of leads into this last part here of what effects can aging have on muscles. And largely, we know that muscles begin to shrink over time. They begin to atrophy, as we say. As we said, you have less muscle, fibers, fewer myofibrils, fewer myofilaments. So we lose the power and the ability to produce lots of force and tension. So typically, older individuals, usually not always, but they're usually a bit weaker than younger individuals. You lose a lot of our type 2 fibers, so those very fast twitch fibers, which again are contributing to very quick, rapid contractions, producing lots of tension and strength. These can be replaced by some other type of connective tissue, so largely fat. So when I did my gross anatomy, our cadaver dissection, one of our cadavers was extremely old and frail, and she was extremely skinny, and she had extremely small biceps brachii muscle in the upper arm. And again, it was largely gone. It was still there, but it was just so small. You could see how very little force would be able to be produced by that muscle, right? Now you can kind of combat some of these changes by changing your habits in terms of your training and your exercise and what you eat and whatnot. But in general, as you age, you're going to have these things begin to slow down. The size of the muscles is also going to begin to decrease as well. All right. So that is the end of our lecture. If you have any questions at all, please do not hesitate to reach out. Give me a call, shoot me an email, and I'll be happy to answer any of your questions. All right. I'll see you in the next video.